Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Welcome. This is Jamie and Jerry from LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. Welcome back. And actually, welcome back is a good term to use because we have our resident expert joining us, and he has his expert buddy joining us as well. So, you know what? It's always a good day when we have Ken on, and we're looking forward to spending time with Dee as well.
It's true. And I told Jamie yesterday, I said, I'm cleaning up my office. Ken Shelton's coming on. I have to have things looking good. Yeah, get up a notch when Ken's coming. So, Jamie is our first guest that has appeared 3 times. I think maybe so. Ken, our first that we've had on 3 times. He's that good. Ken Shelton and Dee Lanier have just written a book, and it is the most timely book because what do we talk about every day? AI.
Right.
Their book is called The Promise and the Perils of AI in Education. And I know one thing for sure. If you want to get a balanced view of anything, go to Ken Shelton. He will give you a very balanced view. He looks at the whole picture and not just one way or another. And so I'm very excited to talk about the book today and to meet Dee. And started. So let's start with Dee. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you know Ken Shelton.
My introduction is I'm a friend of Ken Shelton. That's the way it works whenever we are in the same vicinity.
I'm going to use that too. I'm going to use that too.
That's the way this works. This is the way this works. But Ken and I go way back. We actually refer to each other as brothers. We've had people relate to us on Twitter like, wait, is he really your brother? And so that's always fun. The folks we respond to. We both obviously are in the education space and in technology. Our paths probably first crossed in, I want to say maybe sometime between 2013 and 20. He says 2010. Actually, I'm just #getting old, so who knows anymore. I used to be a high school business teacher before getting to technology and really supporting teachers in that regard. And, earning some certifications to support my own staff, then turned into doing presentations and spaces, and then being asked to do a little bit more here and there. And then when Ken and I started to link up, just realized that we had a brotherhood. We had a lot of common interests. My background is in sociology. And so you could probably, Ken, then we speak around issues of race and equity. And that also pertains to education. And then so the synergies just sync up really easy right there.
Oh, that is fantastic. And Ken, you have corrected Dee and said we actually met March 2011 in the chat.
I'm used to being corrected by Ken. This is nothing new.
Oh, well.
I wouldn't say corrected. I would say further context.
Further context. That's perfect. And Ken has been a mentor to me for years. And I think it was early 2000s. I don't know if you have it anywhere. That's what I'm thinking, because I followed you first as a photographer, I think.
So I think, you and I go back.
Way back.
I mean, it's a minimum of 10 years. So yeah definitely. And you all mentioned this is, I'm the only guest who's been on 3 times. So the 3rd time's a charm.
3rd time's a charm.
And Jerry, you said you cleaned up your office. So I messed up my office to make it look like I've been busy doing something.
I love that. What have you been busy doing?
Well, as you all shared, part of the, some of the big projects I have for this year, one was to complete this book with Dee. And a lot of folks that ask about, the book in general, I just tell them that the one thing that Dee and I both do is we don't rush to anything. It's the, and in fact, this quote is in the book. And of course, I do have a bias with this is it's a quote from the late coach John Wooden. And as many of my friends know, I went to UCLA, go Bruins. And the quote is, "Be quick, but don't hurry." And so with Dee and I, with this book, it was, let's be quick to gain a full understanding, but don't hurry to just rush a book out there. And I know some people have done that. I'll let readers judge the quality and the caliber of the content based upon that. But for us, it was more a function of, let's look at the big picture. Let's look at where we were, where we are, what are we seeing, what are we hearing, what are we not seeing and not hearing? And then now, how can we provide a comprehensive analysis on that is accessible to educators across all spectrums of responsibility and influence, and do it in a way that, as the way the book is structured, that is packaged to where it is easily digestible, but serves as a thinking catalyst for who we are as educators and what we do as education with respect to it from a systemic and institutionalized point of view.
And that's your superpower. You always make people think deeper when they speak to you.
I'll take it. It gets me in good trouble sometimes, but I don't care. Because,
you push thinking, and I like that. I appreciate that very much.
And I think the time that you've taken also has allowed you a perspective that others may not have had as well. You
Without a doubt.
are changing every day, right? So you've taken the time and really kind of been able to navigate in a great way. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and plus the other thing that Dee and I, we consistently, and this is where I will stress two things, and I even bring this up in my workshops, is to the point that you both, because I've known all of you on here for a long time, is you cannot simultaneously say that you value critical thinking, but then have your default be to reject things like that I bring up. Like, we don't have to agree, and that's okay. Some things I would say we don't have to agree upon, but the whole idea being, are you thinking about perspectives, or in my case, being a Black male educator, voices that you have not heard? Because what happens oftentimes is that the putting the die in the water, the immediate response is usually defensive, denial, and dismissal. Yeah. And it's like, so you do that, but then I've seen you say how you want to support students in developing critical thinking skill. Make it make sense. So that's number one. Number two, what I think is also equally as important is that if we value collaboration, one of the key conditions I always say when it comes to collaboration is it has to be voluntary. Dee and I were not voluntold, you have to co-author a book. Dee and I both, I'll give you a little background for your listeners as well. The nexus was Dee and I were either in one of our text message threads or on a call, and I was being hypercritical of a lot of the things that I was hearing around artificial intelligence. And full disclosure, most of it was looking at AI from a strictly utopian lens. And I was telling Dee, like, they're not looking at the big picture. They gotta, I see the, and this kind of led to the titles. I'm like, I see the promise that is there, but the people that are talking about it are either unaware of the potential perils or intentionally overlooking them. And he and I were talking, and eventually it was like, I know what we can do to amplify our voices. What are your thoughts on you and I collaborating on a book and putting it on wax? And that's
can I pick it up from there?
Yeah, please.
Because the story is pretty fun. It's really cool because it's the way that he and I connect. So for your listeners that don't know, Ken and I also are co-hosts on a podcast, The Liberated Educator. And the way that got started was similar to what Ken just described about the book, which was to say, we're always talking about these things. Matter of fact, when we're having these conversations, typically if we're in the same setting, people start to pick up on the intensity of our conversation. They come and they start to sit with us. And the next thing you know, we had a little mini crowd around us and they're listening in on our conversations. And we would regularly just joke with one another, like, you know what? It would be really good as if we just recorded our conversation. Like, we could just record our conversations and let the public hear those. And then was having a conversation with another mutual friend, the buddy, Brian Romero Smith, and just shared, yeah, Ken and I keep talking about starting a podcast. And he said, let me produce it. Okay. Well, let's go. So that turned into a couple of seasons worth of material and content. And also, like what Kim was saying about just in general, the topic of AI, we use, if you're not familiar with CPT, the term CPT, it stands for Colored People Time, which is oftentimes used internally within Black people, Black culture, to say, yeah, we may show up a little bit later than what is on the invite, but also to know that that's just cultural. Also to know when we show up, and when we're there. So why are you rushing me? So there's that. Say, well, if you ever follow any of our podcasts, they always have a CPT format. So we've been doing that for a couple of years. And then when we started having these conversations about AI, and again, they started as just our private conversation. These were lots of phone calls, text messages, every medium of which you can consider us DMing one another based on something we saw on Twitter, right? And so we're seeing the same things, and that's the thing. And I think that's part of our brotherhood and our kindred spirit is seeing something similar. Like, you know what? I'm seeing this, but nobody's pointed out the other side of it. So with that, we then determined, what would it look like to either record a podcast series or to write a book. And then we came up with the idea of, well, what if we did a combo of both? And what if we did it in a way that was just really authentic to us and also could streamline and be efficient in that let's do the work of setting up an outline. Let's do the work of doing some of our research. Let's do all that. But instead of going super hi-fi with our audio and all that, let's record our conversations. And then if Brian is willing to deal with that and to produce it, then we'll go with it. But by and large, we just need to get our thoughts out, because the way that Ken and I kind of volley off of one another, even when we have an outline and say we're going to talk on these things in this order, and I may be prepared to say something. I have my Post-it notes always on my desk, and then Ken says something that just takes the conversation in another direction. I'm like, yo, what you just said made me think of. And so we recorded our conversations, and then from there, we used the recordings as our original transcript to then go in and start writing from. So that's
brilliant.
That's the process.
Brilliant, because talking is thinking. And so that was your process. That was your process for writing the book, was just dialogue. And you know what? That's where books kind of fall, because of the procrastination of actually putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard or whatever it may be. So you did the best thing and just talked it out. And that's brilliant. That is so brilliant. Everything came together in that way. And that was also, because of that process, you were able to take your time in getting it out there and getting, watching. I kind of see you, I don't know, maybe this was part of it, kind of just like watching everyone, kind of like seeing like the dead ends they're kind of going in, the directions that may not have worked or possibly were working well. And then you probably were able to learn from that, kind of watching everyone.
100% agree. You know what? I'll add the other thing to it is, it's one of those things that I bring up, and Dee and I talked about, around anybody who believes, which I believe we all would agree upon this, is if you have a comprehensive approach to literacy when it comes to learning experiences, I always bring this up in my workshops, and Dee and I have talked about this, is the way I define literacy is in two parts. So one is I define it simply as effective communication. That's number one. Then number two, that effective communication can occur in 5 different dimensions, which is reading, writing, speaking, listening, and observing. And so, Jamie, to your point, think about all 5 of those and how all 5 of those have played a critical role in what will end up being essentially the finished product that is going to publication. We did observe, we watched. I watched what a lot of folks that were putting out there, what they were saying. It reminds me of even my days playing college sports, where one of the best lessons you can do in preparation for a competition is to watch a lot of film of your opponent. Okay. So that's number one. Then the other thing, to your point, was part of our creative process was to talk things out. I have an idea. I have an idea. I have an idea. And we would, I don't want to say we one up each other. We would, the way it works with Dee and I is we're constantly leveling up each other. And then that turned into, to be honest with y'all, the behind the scenes, that was part of the writing process. Dee would write something and then I would read it and I'd read it again. And then I'd read it again. And then I'd read it again. And then I'd put a comment literally on our draft. And I would say, dude, I read this. And then again, then again, then again. And it made me go back and read what I wrote because I got to step up my game now too.
Wow. That's great. That is great to have that kind
Power
of
of collaboration. Yeah.
Correct.
Absolutely. Well, we motivate one another. I think maybe part of both of us having athletics as part of our background, like in knowing. So if you're in the same team, you're not competing when you are in a meet, but you are competing when you're in practice.
Right.
Right.
Sure.
And you're pushing each other for the same goal of being better. And so Ken and I definitely do that. Ken pushes me on a regular basis. And so, gotta bring my A game, but I would also say, in addition to us being not only being critical of what others were saying or not saying, that's really what it has a lot to do with what they weren't saying, but also the time gave us opportunity to test our own preconceptions, right? So we had early preconceptions, just like everybody did, right? I mean, November 2022, this thing hit everyone like a bombshell. And of course, everyone had questions immediately. Those questions were, if they are in the same spheres as us, how does this affect education?
Right.
But the difference is Ken and I observed real quickly, everyone's jumping to, is this going to allow for students to cheat? What is this? What are the ramifications for plagiarism? And I'm like, wait a minute. I have much deeper questions. I have much different questions. And no one else seems to be asking these questions. And why does it seem like the only person that I talk to that has similar thinking is Ken? Like literally no one else is asking the same question. Even just looking at it and saying, well, why is it that we're so concerned about writing assignments exclusively? Why is that? Whereas exactly what we're talking about, how our book was developed through conversation. Right? What we should be having a conversation around is original thought. Right. Which original thought is a completely different thing. But how do you make sure that you are encouraging original thought, developing original thought, appreciating original thought, if all you do is assign writing assignments that students as well as teachers are just looking at, this is something I have to do in order to get done and move on to the next thing. It's not about development, at least at this stage, thinking in the K-12 spaces. Typically, it's not about development of thought. It's around executing on a standardized way of communication. If that's the only way in which we require students to voice their opinions and to come up with their thoughts on different concepts, then of course we're going to feel threatened by something like AI that can generate that on its own, right? So then the value of student voice was never really the question. That's the only question that's being brought up. So that's what we started doing.
Is the 5-paragraph essay the holy grail of being able to express yourself? And of course, it's not. There are so many other ways that students can do that. And we have to quit worrying about the cheating. I think that there's other things we can do.
Well, if we are evaluating student work, and we have for decades now, if we're evaluating their understanding of different concepts based on the banking process, I'm going to give to you, and then you are going to give back to me exactly what I gave to you.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And if that is going to also come in the form of either in written form or in multiple choice, right? Like we're actually never elevating what thinking is. We're not actually developing thinking in those scenarios. Right.
Surface
So,
level.
so,
Yeah.
so the thing that some people were afraid of and terrified of with the introduction of ChatGPT in late 2022, we saw it as this opportunity for us to potentially reshape what education looks like.
Yes.
But that's not been, by and large, what most people have done. What they've done is say, what we got to do is put we have to stomp out this opportunity for students to use this for cheating. And we need to highlight the blessing it is for teachers to be able to have something that can develop content for their students much easier and more efficiently to buy them back time. But like, no one's questioning the efficacy of worksheets. They're just saying we can develop them faster.
Right.
Like,
Right.
let's question the product itself and why we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And if all we're going to do is use AI to put that in hyperdrive, then we have to question a whole lot more.
I mean, if you're afraid of an assignment being copied, pasted, turned in, then you should be more afraid of the type of assignment that you've been assigning. You need to look at the value of that. There is no value. So now let's really think about what we should be doing. We should be giving authentic opportunities for learning, real world scenarios, problem-based learning. Let kids solve problems. Let them dig deeper. Let them have their own ideas. But I wonder too why, Dee, what you were talking about is happening. And sometimes I feel like schools are going slowly. There are some schools who really haven't even been able to address this yet. And then some teachers are starting to dabble in it. It's been a long time, but honestly, schools are kind of heads down worrying about, money and they have other things that they're worried about, and they know it's there. They got to do it, but they're not there yet. And some have hired consultants to come in. I think the best approach is let's have kids figure it out along with the teachers. We need to do that, but there's also the safety component. I know we need to talk about that too, because that's huge. But there's so many other factors. Maybe that's part of it too. Maybe because there's so many factors, they're putting their heads in the sand a little bit. What's happening?
Well, the fact that you're asking questions is the starting point, right? And you're asking the sort of questions that I think should always be on the table. All of the ramifications, all of the questions, all the considerations. There are no bad questions, right? When we are curious and cautious and wondering in the room of what are all the many things that this may potentially bring about, and then how do we test all of these considerations? But I think the biggest obstacle in the way of doing that is that we set up systems for the sake of efficiency.
Yes.
And we don't want anything to interrupt those systems that have been put in place.
Right.
Right. Those systems are put in place and they are operating as designed. Right. We even have, punitive systems that are put in place in order to deal with certain things as designed. And when something like ChatGPT and generative AI hit the scene, you're talking about major disruption that hit us immediately with, there was not a lot of lead in time. Even when we attempt, I think in very limited ways, we compare the use of AI or the emergence of AI with like the introduction of the internet, right, into education. So, but we also recognize there's a lot of differences.
Yes.
Including, right, y'all remember Prodigy.net? Y'all remember Ask Jeeves? You remember Dog? We had a slow go at seeing these things coming into our space. And then, of course, when, Google came in and then emerged as the front runner, and then, right, look, even just talking that through, how many years did we have to start to develop our thinking around the integration and the adoption of this technology in education? ChatGPT hit the scene
Yeah.
public for free,
Right.
and it was here,
Right.
right?
Right.
Immediate, right? So it's immediate presentation to the public along with systems that have
Yeah.
been put in place with desired intentional results. And you mentioned money, and one of the things we talk about in the book is even when we think about like standardized testing and high stakes testing, what's the real goal behind those things? Is it really for helping students evaluate and assess where they are and learn how to improve? We already know that that's not the truth. Is it to properly predict how successful they will be potentially if they go into higher education in the long-term future? We already know that that's not the case. So what is it and why does it exist? Well, we also know that there are billions of dollars tied in. So there's finances involved, right? So all of those things are systems that have been integrated and put in place and have been operating and functioning, rather successfully. And then AI just came in as a massive disruptive force.
Yeah, it's true. We don't have the time.
Conflict. Yeah, in conflict with those systems, right? In conflict with, this is not about higher order thinking. This is about low level assessment and knowledge attainment and regurgitation, right? So when you bring in something that disrupts these systems, that also there are lots of financial ramifications involved, then I understand why there would be putting your head in the sand. I understand that.
Powerful.
Right. Yeah, it's true. We had a guest on, Darren Coxon, and he said, we're in the AI revolution, but for education, it needs to be the AI evolution. We do. It is important to take your time, just as you two did with your book, making sure you're doing the observations and checking everything out and learning along the way. So it is important to take the time to do it. But there are some that are just ignoring it altogether, shutting it down for kids. And that's not good either. We have to teach them, we have to coexist. It's not going away. And that AI literacy has to be a huge component of it, starting point for teachers and students.
I know Ken has a lot to say on this, but I can say one more thing, bro, just to say, this was one of my early thinkings, right? One of my early thoughts, and then it took some time to test it, and it hasn't been disproven yet. And that is to say, when you consider that there are different environments that have different levels of embracing, if you will, of AI, right? So when you have, and this is another one of the examples we utilize in we talk about in the book and I utilize in keynotes, is that you may have one environment that completely shuts down the use of AI and restricts it. And you have to think, well, what are the ramifications of that? Also in your mind, can your mind's eye imagine what those schools students look like?
Right. Well, there's just, look at this.
Right. And there's other environments where there's limited access, and typically limited access looks like no for students, yes for teachers.
Yes.
Also with limited support in how to utilize whatever tools they are allowed to use, but definite no for students. And if there's a definite no for students, then there also means that there are systems that are put in place to punish those who are caught cheating, right? I'm using air quotes because it has a lot to say on that topic. And then you have another environment where they say, you know what, this is new. We don't know or understand all of these things, but what we're going to do is actually experiment and do some co-learning together. And in that setting, just ask the question, not like deep in the future, because I think we do this in education all the time, right? Like 5 years from now, who do you think is being more prepared? No. I have a 17-year-old daughter who's applying for college right now, right? In those three different scenarios, which scenario is setting up students for future, not 10 years from now, not 5 years from now, but literally for their college application? Who's being prepared for acceptance into their higher learning institution of preference more? A, B, C, B, or C, right? So there are
I mean,
disparities, and there's oftentimes a fictionalized limitation that is established that says some cannot because of various things that we've just made up, right? We're going to call something plagiarism that isn't plagiarism. We're going to, come up with all sorts of things to try and limit what we don't know, understand, or can control. Yo, bro.
I'm honestly, I'm enjoying it. Listen, I think I'm a guest / listener on this particular episode, but you all have touched on a lot of the things that I bring up. Dee and I talked about it. We do have elements of all of the above in much greater detail and an analytical approach in the book. I think there's a couple of what I would say elements of misinformation that need to be dispelled when it comes to this. So I'll rewind the clock back to something that you all shared earlier, and that is when Google search became essentially the norm for search engines.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all remember, but the big opposition within education to that was, don't let kids use Google because they'll just Google the answers.
Right.
Google the answer. Right.
Yeah.
And of course, many of us were like, well, we should be asking different questions there.
Yes, exactly.
And the additional questions around that were things like, help me understand the learning value of memorizing words that I can get the definition of the word in Google in less than 3 seconds. Like all of those things that required, I won't say significant, but certainly distinct pedagogical shifts.
Right.
And it forced it. Then I even remember when it was like, well, don't let the kids use Wikipedia because they're just going to copy and paste from it. And I remember one of the big ones was that information isn't reliable. And of course, my counter to that was, you mean like the way I copied out of my Encyclopedia Britannica, which the information was only as reliable as the latest volume that my grandparents were able to afford to be able to get in the home. And so you're seeing that with this around this fervent denial / resistance to, you can't do it because of this. You can't do it because of that. We got to block this. We got to stop that. And what's really going on that I bring up in one of my talks, and we talk about it a little bit in the book, is this whole idea around dynamic. That's what's really going on.
Yes.
I encourage educators to think about this because in full disclosure, this stream of thought was exactly how I started my classroom teaching career, primarily because this is the way I was taught in grad school, and this is the type of environment that I learn within. It must be an authority-controlled environment of which you hold dominion over the bodies of behaviors and the learning of all of your students. And if you don't demonstrate that dominion, then you're an ineffective educator. Think about how things like classroom management, the children are not seated quietly in rows and listening to you, then that means that you lack some sort of classroom management skill. If the children can't demonstrate degrees of learning that is solely assessed off this multiple choice of this true false test, then it must be something you did. Okay. So you see all these things going on. And my whole thing is to really start to, I always encourage the kids, don't give any oxygen to the narratives that propagate a false understanding of what's really going on. And that is that education is relational, not transactional, number one. Number two, learners are all going to come in with different degrees of dispositions, experience, life experiences, and access to resources that exist outside of the boundaries of the school or the locus of control of the school district. And so to the point that Dee just brought up, and again, we go much more greater into detail of this. I'll start off with the whole plagiarism thing. Legally, you cannot plagiarize AI. And I've had educators, I don't want to say just teachers, I've had this, well, it is plagiarism. No, it is not, period. And it's not Ken's opinion. I'm going to pull up Black's Law Dictionary, which is a legal dictionary that is essentially the industry standard. I'm going to show you how it's defined. And even workshops that I've done outside of the United States where I tell them, here's how it's defined legally in the United States. Let's look at how it's defined in your country. I have yet, and you're talking about a half a dozen now, I have yet to go to another country of which plagiarism is defined pretty much any differently than it is here. And essentially it's taking the work of another human being and representing it as your own.
Right.
So that's not even a conversation in the AI context. It's not a thing. It's like saying, I want to teach you how to make cold fire. It's not a thing. Okay. Now, when you get to the cheating aspect, there's a couple of things. So one, in our book, we cite research that was done by a couple of professors at Stanford that I don't remember what the sampling size was, but ultimately it looked at students that admitted to engaging in a behavior that was associated with cheating. And at the time they first did it was 70%. Then they did the same research after ChatGPT became available. That 70% after ChatGPT was still 70%. So
Interesting.
what does that tell you? They're
Yeah.
not anything that what it told me was the following. And again, Dee and I talked about this at length, and then we're like, we have to have this in the book. It is a significant part of more than one chapter. It reminds me of all the following. So when I think about my experiences, and I wrote about it in the book, is what were the conditions of which I engaged in an activity or an action that is often associated with cheating, that I always say we need to reframe that to potentially detrimental to my learning or can compromise my learning. When did I do those things? And I have a whole list of those things on there. But like even with what you all are talking about, think about all of us on this, and then your listeners. High stakes testing is one. Like for example, the story I love to share is in one of my classes in college, 11-week quarter, and the professor had it to where the midterm was 40% and the final was 60% of my grade. And I'm like, okay, but I'm in class for 11 weeks and you're telling me that you want to distill what is representation of my learning and influences my GPA,
Yeah.
my eligibility because I played sports. And if I want to go to grad school, it's going to be reflective on my transcripts. You're going to take 11 weeks and distill it down to only 2 instances. And here's the other key. Both were also timed. Midterm was an hour, final exam was 3 hours. So you see, when you start adding those things in, I'm like, okay, I see the game for what it is. And now I'm going to play that game. And I'm going to utilize whatever necessary resources I have at my disposal to put myself into a more favorable position to be successful. It also happened in classes where the professor said that they were going to grade on a curve. We don't have enough time to go into it on this one, but I would just encourage the listeners, go and look up the history of the bell curve. Look at who invented it. Look at why they invented it. Yeah,
I do
exactly.
reference that in my book, in that first book.
Yes,
We
he
got another
does. Okay.
What?
So if you understand that historical context, then it would make sense for me as a young Black male student. Oh, you're going to play games and make it a curve? Okay, I'm going to play that game. Okay. So I'm going to, and one of the things I share is like, I would buy, when I would have exams that had to be written in a blue book, of course they had to be handwritten. So we can even talk about ableism and things like that. But nevertheless, because what happens if I'm not a fast writer, but I am a fast thinker? Okay. So aside from all that, it's like, okay, good. So I'm gonna play the game. I would always buy 2 blue books, open up the staples of both, take pages out of one, put them in the other, close the staples down, write my notes on the inside pages. And now when I go into my lecture hall to do my exam, open up the staples, pull those pages of my notes out, stick those pages between my leg, close it up. Now it still looks like a full blue book. And now I can write. And you can say, well, that's quote unquote cheating. My counter to that is, well, think about what that was the symptom. What was the disease? What was the catalyst for that? High stakes testing, time testing, power dynamics, all of those sorts of things. So when it comes to this whole thing around artificial intelligence, and especially our large language models, if your default is to accuse a student of cheating, I would say, first of all, it's not cheating. I would say it runs the risk of compromising or being detrimental to their learning. Yes. And Dee and I have it in there because it's 3 questions that Dee brings up around ethical questions that should be asked. And question number 3 is, am I sacrificing long-term benefits for short-term gain? Those are the types of conversations that we should be having with our learners as well.
Right.
Because my whole thing is, if you want to rely on a large language model to speak for you and do your writing for you, let's talk about that. Are you okay with something else speaking for you? Are you okay with putting something in there and getting it back and saying, I'm going to turn this in? How do you know it's accurate? How do you know it's correct? Is it representational of how you would say it? Like, rather than hiding these things behind fear, privacy or blocking, that is to me aligned with a more digital literate approach to using what I describe as another emerging technology.
It's
build intrinsic motivation in there. Like they don't feel comfortable with it. And a lot of kids you talk to, they don't feel comfortable with the skating by and just copying and pasting. They actually don't when you talk to them. It makes them very uncomfortable. They don't like it. They don't.
Correct. It reminds me of, what many teachers are trying to do, and many teachers are actually required to do, is to write, what are the essential questions of a lesson, right? Essential for who?
Essential for who? Exactly.
Essential for who? And so when you frame these are the reasons why we are wanting to control and suppress and block these tools, you're looking at it from the lens of your perspective and what you find as dangerous and what you are fearful of. But the question really should be for the student, right? And so I love Ken's questioning of how is this potentially robbing you of your own thought, your own voice, and how does that make you feel, right? Like when I believe in students coming up with their own contracts, their own agreement. And so instead of it being placed on them, right, they get to co-develop what they agree to. And then therefore also they have their entire social group of that classroom in that environment to also hold each other accountable. Hey, we said that we were only going to use these tools in these ways. Remember, that's what we contracted as a group. And that may even look different in a different environment. But if there can't be a place to even learn how these tools work, then we are continuing to perpetuate the disadvantages that already exist in schools. It's just the plain and simple fact.
It's exactly right. And what you were just describing is just good common sense instructional best practice, building buy-in and ownership for their own learning, right? I mean, that's, and honestly, when we're talking about the, promises and perils, I think that's a promise. I think that maybe because this is coming on so fast, hopefully there will be a shift in the way things are done in instruction. And so perhaps there will be more personalized learning. And quite frankly, personalized learning really wasn't done because it's too hard. But now we have tools to do it well. It really was done well because it was it really just didn't make sense. I even did workshops on it. And a lot of times I'm like, you're going to have to do it your own way because it's really just not logical for us to really do this. It is now, can be now. That's the beauty. And is that a promise in your eyes too? Dee's kind of like, and says, yeah, maybe.
Well, it's a potential, right? To even give clarity to what we're attempting to do in the title of the book and talking about the promises and perils, which is to say, we're not looking at it from just a utopian or dystopian framework, right? We're looking at it from, there's a full picture here. And so there are questions that should be asked, and we should investigate those questions. And we should also know that the answers are process pending, right? These are in development. I'm not attempting to evade the question, but I am aware of the fact that the people who are developing these tools, by the way, plural, right? That's another thing that just gets me a little crazy is when, AI and generative AI is equated with exclusively with one tool, right? Just because it was the first tool that we were introduced to does not mean it's the only tool or the most effective tool, right? There's a lot to be said about that way of thinking and the way in which we automatically gravitate to that way of thinking in general, right? And that we're never cautious and careful about what we do and how we communicate and how we then take action with what we are learning. So all of that is a part of, it is an ongoing understanding that there's potential for good things. There's also potential for bad things. And some of those questions currently are, I don't know. We don't know yet. To be honest, or the answers may change tomorrow. The terms and services are being updated. The LLMs are being changed. Algorithms are being adjusted. So we're learning as we're going, but the question is are we going to learn, and are we going to continue learning, or are we just going to either give simple answers, or are we going to suppress people from actually finding answers?
I love the depth of your questions and how you have thought so deeply about this topic, because I do think that that's where educators are. They've kind of entered at the substitution level. What can this substitute for me, instead of how can we teach differently, and how can we enable students to use this to personalize their education? So that's,
And that's kind of more great because it's come on so fast. It's that fire hose and you kind of don't know what to do. So at least experiment with it, and that's okay because that's your way of learning. And so maybe, the substitution on the SAMR model really is the first thing that people are doing just to kind of explore it. Maybe that's okay, but you need to get to a point to say like, oh, okay, now what? How am I going to do this? What does this make sense? How is this going to affect teaching and learning? How is this going to make a change? And so some people are, we have opposite ends of the spectrum. We have some people who won't even touch it, haven't done anything, buried their heads in the sand. Others who have just kind of like really gone quickly, but haven't thought through really. Others, I don't know.
What you just brought up is exactly why we have the subtitle to the book, Ethics and Equity have entered the chat.
Yeah.
Literally what you just brought up. For those that are all in, great. What's your ethical approach here? What are the questions we should be asking with respect to those? And for those that are either ardently opposed to it, or I would argue those that start off at that substitution/surface level, but then don't go any more deeply, then what does the equity component look like with that?
Right.
And I wanted to share this because I think this should be a part of, our conversation. And we do have this in the book, is when it comes to the whole idea around personalization. Before my whole thing are a couple of questions that I always pose that begin before you even get to using whatever artificial intelligence platform or feature that you have. And I mentioned feature because, to Dee's point, yes, we can speak on LLMs, but AI is now being included as a component of many of the popular platforms that educators are using in varying degrees. And of course, we could get into the technical aspect of that AI that's included. Where are they getting that from? Many of those other platforms. But nevertheless, the personalization aspect, these are some of the key questions that I pose in a workshop and that we have in the book. When it comes to personalization, first of all, how well do you know your students? You can't personalize if you don't even know who's in the room.
Yes.
And it has to be more than correct. And it has to be more than a surface level. The way I describe it is like every child has an invisible cultural knapsack of their experiences, their perspectives, their views, and their ethics every time they enter your classroom. As an educator, you're not entitled to look in that backpack. What ideally we are supported and afforded the time to do is allow the students the recognition that open it up and pull out what you think will be helpful for me to connect to you in the context of the agreement that we have, that my job is to support you in the context of learning X content area. Okay. So that's where it starts off. Because again, you can't personalize. How can you personalize something if you don't even know the learner on a more personal level?
great.
That's number one. And then the second one, which goes to what Dee and I have talked about, and he's bringing up here, like, how do you even define ethics in the classroom? Because if they're solely defined by top-down decision-making, which is, by the way, expanded upon in Dee's first book, top-down decision-making, whether it be district to school to teacher, teacher to student, then that creates a power dynamic situation of where you've not only stripped students of any degree of their own agency, but it is authority controlled. It's top down. You must do the following thing. And if you don't do those, there's going to be a punitive response, conformity and compliance. So to me, what does it look like to co-construct that conversation around how should we define ethics in the context of this classroom? And what does that look like with respect to how we collaborate, the platforms that we use, the ways in which we leverage digital resources, the authenticity of the work that we do? You see, when you start doing that, Jimmy, to your point, it does get to the point of ownership. And what I think, unfortunately, isn't brought up enough in education is a focus on student engagement. And I always tell people, tell me how you get from engagement to ownership. Because I can tell you how I can performatively engage in my learning, But
Right,
that's not good enough when it comes to this whole thing. And then the follow-up questions I bring up are things like, so for teachers, that's like, what role do I play in supporting my students? How are they using AI? Newsflash, if they have internet access at home, they've already been using it. So rather than hide it, hey,
Right.
what's something cool you've done with it that isn't school related? Do you see how it might be helpful for you here? Do you see how it's another resource? Do you see how it can augment your learning, not compromise your learning? You see, these are the conversations that we need to be having. And then I would even ask, are there any good ways that you're using it? And then how might we utilize those in the context of learning here? How might you share those with your classmates? Like, be transparent about that stuff. That's what I would do. I've done that with focus groups with kids where I'm like, have you all found any cool ways to use it? Oh yeah, I did this for blank. I did this for blank. That's awesome. How might that work in a science class? How might that work in an English class? And they're like, usually it's one of two responses. I hadn't thought about that. Or what's worse, yeah, but they won't let us use it.
Right.
right,
And
right.
I'm like, there's a missed opportunity. There's an example of not only is it personalization, but it's that intersection of personalization and ownership of learning. But to just to simply try to kick the can down the road and
Yeah.
hope that it's not going to be a thing and deny that it can have this impact unless you're in direct control over it is it's a false narrative. So at minimum, it's a false narrative, and it was most likely is at least it's an incomplete narrative.
This is the way it goes. I just need you to know, kid says something and it makes me think of something. And it's the reason why our podcast goes like this, as well as then the book was developed. I just thought of two things. And it was actually something, that you would mention, Jamie, in highlighting, the SAMR model. I don't know about you all, but I can speak for myself and say, I never predetermined or created based on my own brilliance, so to speak, something that utilized technology that met M or R. Never happened because of me. It always happened because of the cloud. It always happened because of the community. It always happened because there was enough freedom
Yes.
so that things were discovered.
Yes.
And I just happened, because I was looked at as the authority in the room, that I had the privilege of saying, hey, everybody, y'all need to see this. And it was looking at what someone else created, something that I had no idea was possible. Right. And so even also what Ken is bringing up, if we don't allow for the opportunities of being surprised and wowed, and then others being able to bring in their learnings and understandings elements. So then now we are now revolutionizing what a lesson is, because we are learning how to utilize tools in ways in which we didn't even recognize their capabilities prior to that, right? Like, that's when that happens. It happens serendipitously. It doesn't happen because I was an expert and I was so brilliant, I came up with a Mozart of a lesson plan. That never happened. That never does. It's where you give parameters, right? It's like we're bringing up sports, right? Like this is out of bounds and points are scored by this and by this. Everything else, go. Right? There's lots of creativity within there. And so when we speak about, ethics and equity, this is the second point it's going to make. And that is, we hear these terms thrown around often, but what we've not witnessed enough of is, well, then how does a teacher or how does an educator hear these terms and then know how to properly apply them? Like, what are they hearing and understanding? So if you hear, oh, but we have to be ethical with the use of AI, it's like, okay, now pause, define them. And do you even have a rubric or a grid for ethics that you utilize outside of AI, prior to November 2022? How did you define and how did you utilize ethics?
Exactly.
Now, another one of those terms that, I know that me and my brother, we are going to cough loudly and get somebody's attention if they just try and throw out there, and then what you also want to do is make sure that you are evaluating the results for bias, and then they keep on moving. I'm like, wait, hold on.
What does that even mean? Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a
What does that
question.
even mean? Well, so yes, thank you. I mean, I look, I'm obviously I know y'all on this quite well, but James, what does that even mean? Like, and Jerry knows me very well with this. Even within the anti-bias workshops I do, I'm like, there are 12 cognitive biases, really 13. I'm like, we need to look at what each one is, how it's defined, what are examples you've seen of this in the context of your professional and personal environment? How does this affect the opportunities for you to perform at your best and learners to perform at their best? You can't use these terms as just throwaway. It is obtuse and it is dismissive to the point that I even brought it up in the book that it's almost like I feel like I need to mention it, but I don't want to admit that I don't know anything about it. So I'll just mention it and keep moving on, and I'll do it as quickly as I possibly can so that you can check off that box and you can say, well, I did bring it up. And like Dee shared, for the listeners, Dee shared in the chat, it's malfeasance. Like, check for the bias. Which bias are we talking about? We're talking about bandwagon effect. We're talking about choice supportive. We're talking about halo effect. We're talking about confirmation. Are we talking about curse of knowledge? Are we talking about Dunning-Kruger? I mean, I can keep going on and on and on. And it's like it is what I'll just say is this is when you do that, it leads me to not only ask more questions, but also question what your perspective is entering into this conversation. If you're willing to take some of these terms and just insert it in there like it's some sort of a pacifying checkbox and not provide at least an opportunity for a reader, a listener, or a learner to go down that rabbit hole, both directly with you, but also at some point on their own.
Yeah. Peel the onion. Yeah.
Peel the onion. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Ken, I have a question for you for listeners that are thinking, like, I took your workshops, so I remember the 12, but I don't remember them. I couldn't name them right now. How could people find out more about the 12? Because I don't know that everyone knows. I didn't know before I took your workshop.
Yeah, and I mean, and so I'll answer your question within two parts. So number one, this is exactly why, going back to what Dee shared, this is why I always ask people, when you start to use terms of art, or as I like to say, a word salad of jazzy jargon, we should always insist that the speaker define the terms in context with receipts. So this is why the workshops that Dee and I do both together and independently, when I say, here are some of the terms I'm going to use, I literally say, here's how they're defined in this context. So that when I use them later, it's part of the cognitive approach to language acquisition. You learn the term, you see how it's defined, but you also apply it in context. Right. So the point being, we bring up all of these in our book, and they are defined both how they're defined and in the context of AI and education. So there's two layers to those definitions. What does confirmation bias, how is it defined? Then how is it also defined in the context of AI and education? And so for me, it's just a function of, if you wanted to go down the rabbit hole, I mean, there's book after book after book on bias. I mean, my favorite one is Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a professor. I don't know if he's still up at Stanford. It's called Biased. Dee talks about him in his first book. And then obviously, the thing about that is for people to acknowledge and recognize that there you go. For the listeners, Dee is showing a page out of his first book, The Marginalizing Died.
Which, by the way, Ken was the one who was the main catalyst to make sure that I put those in there. So I got to give credit.
Yeah.
And let me be clear for all of us and for the listeners, bias is not always a negative thing. Okay. It's often associated with negative, but it's not always a negative. And it's this whole idea around our brain goes through a cognitive process of organizing information, labeling it, and then identifying patterns of that information, and then looking for things that reinforce some of those patterns. So sometimes it's a positive. If you think about, just to borrow from, my background in sports, there's a reason why athletes, especially professional athletes, are able to do things that to the untrained eye, it looks natural, but I know, no, they've probably practiced that move or that condition thousands of times. And so that's an example of how the bias, you identify the context, It has been labeled, you've gone through the experience, and now based on that prior pattern, you know what to do. It's the common term that you hear with sports newscast or sports broadcasters for events is like, oh my God, that athlete did this almost instinctual. Now it's not instinctual. They've just done that time and time and time again. And so that's why I'm saying it's not always a negative, but to use bias in the context of AI as this throwaway term, it's just, to me, it's disingenuous at a minimum, because it overlooks the need for all of us to really do a much more interrogative analysis of the information that we are receiving, and what type of messaging is it propagating, what type of stereotype things is it reinforcing, what type of patterns that are essentially established in society that is essentially replicating. And my whole thing is, if you approach it from a comprehensive digital literacy approach, then you're able to better, not always 100%, but certainly better identify those things from an analytical perspective, so that now it won't affect how you receive and use that information in the same capacity that it was prior to that.
That
And-
is a
and-
lot to unpack.
Yes, it always is. And if I will add two other quick things, because again, this is what happens when Ken and I should have warned you, right? We go back and forth because he always prompts my thinking. One being, I know that my mind tends to work a little bit differently, in that I don't have the sort of ability to memorize large volumes of content like Ken does. He just does. But I think one of my superpowers is being knowledgeable of a subject and then knowing how to research it, right? And so I think we could also speak to the diversity of I almost said a really, really wrong term. You guys almost caught it. I almost said learning styles. We already know that is incorrect, right? Everybody here knows that's been debunked multiple times over. Okay, actually, I just said something else that if that is news to you, research, right?
Yeah.
From the myths of
that.
learning style. But bringing this to AI, here's an opportunity, I think, right? An opportunity is to utilize one of the things that we recommend in our book, in Promises and Perils of AI in Education, is to utilize 2 or 3 LLMs for everything that you are attempting.
Yeah.
Right. So that experimentation is also going to get you familiar with how those different tools operate, some of their advantages and disadvantages, if you will, in different ways. But nonetheless, if you were to then, something else that we recommend, a good prompt means give it a personality, give it a purpose, and then give it parameters. And so in that regard, even if I don't know the answers, but I know the question, that's most important, right? So I can ask something along the lines of 2 or 3 different LLMs. And I would say maybe even jump to using one that you're less familiar with, and then go back to the one that you're very familiar with, right? Personality, you are a social psychologist, right?
Yes.
Define multiple forms of bias or as it relates to education. And then here's a parameter that Ken and I both love, right? Explain on a 5th grade reading level.
Yeah. I like
Right. Because I made you this person who has a doctorate, but I need to understand it as one who doesn't.
Yes.
Right.
I like that too. Because I think if you can explain things yourself on a 5th grade level, you really do know it. You're not using that word salad of jazzy jargon. And then the world out there.
Yep.
If I may add, there's another component to the reason why 5th grade is the marker. And this is where so you're on the right path, by the way. It's you're on the right path. So there's a couple of things. So one, another layer that we insert into this conversations in our book is a layer of media literacy. And that's where I mentioned like misinformation. And this is a hat tip to 2 of my close friends, Darren Hudgens and Jennifer Lagarde. But the whole idea here being that most major news publications and magazines are written at a 5th grade level. And that's because this has been the determined lexile level that is likely to be the most accessible to the masses.
Yes.
So if I'm asking the LLM to explain it to me on a 5th grade level, whatever it explains by default is likely to be more accessible to a larger audience, a larger group of people. And that's why I always get into, and it's a whole separate conversation, but I always ask when people say, well, use academic language, I'm like, define it for me.
What does that mean?
Give me an example. What does that even mean?
Sure.
Yes.
Well,
Because it's not known, which obviously your listeners will know, that most major news publications are literally written at a 5th grade level. And that's where I get into the whole concept around literacy and illiteracy. I can use really heavy, fancy academic language that are terms of art that we would understand. But if that's not accessible to someone who doesn't work in education, then I'm technically being illiterate because I'm not effectively communicating. This goes back to how I defined it earlier.
Yes.
I'll add one additional layer that I love to do that Dee just shared is I always encourage educators when you use an LLM and you ask it to do something. And I think for me, the distinction here needs to be clear. Google search is you're telling Google to find something for you. And the LLM, you're telling it to do something for you. Yeah. There's your distinct difference, number one. Number two is incorporate in your prompts, always tell it to give you a justification for its response. Because one of the big selling points of these LLMs is, oh, the higher level is more reasoning, more reasoning, more reasoning. Oh, really? Okay. Then I want you to provide that reasoning for me. So in the context of like what Dee just shared, like explain these biases and all these sorts of things, great. But what you explain to me, I want you to provide a reasoning as to why you selected this bias and why you explain it this way. That is another way to get that to approach the response in a more analytical approach. Because again, if you're going to sell me on the fact that the model that I pay for provides a higher level of reasoning, then I'm going to put that reasoning to the test.
Yeah, and it just helps the person that's generating the prompt to understand it better if you're finding out how it works.
Exactly. Yes. And this is, and to connect this back to what you all were sharing earlier around the substitution level or the surface level, this is precisely why I encourage educators to not gravitate towards or rely on and I know a lot of educators do it. They do these prompt library lists. Here is a list of prompts for a science. I'm not going to vilify those because if that's your starting point, fine. But don't let that be your end point. Because my follow-up question in conversations I've had with educators is they say, well, I have this prompt library here. And I said, okay, that's great. I go, now, I'm going to ask a question. They're like, yeah. I'm like, based on that prompt that was provided at library, do you even know what those words mean in the prompt to get it to do what you want? Do you know how to modify those specifically to your need? Do you know how to modify certain components? Do you understand how synonyms work in that context? And of course, usually the answer, unfortunately, is no. And I'm like, that's part of the reason why I'm here. But it's also why I say, if that's where you choose to start, please don't let that be where you end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's why some people are like, well, I've literally heard this comment, Ken, you're being mean to some of the speakers that do this. And I'm like, okay, that assumes two things. I go, one, that assumes I care about their feelings. One, I go, and number two, why is your default that I'm being mean when I'm asking questions?
Right.
Like if I make it as a statement, then I could say, yeah, you know what, you're right. Mm-hmm. I go, but I'm not. I'm asking a question because my whole thing is, and the analogy I like to use is cooking. I'm like, do you want me to just teach you how to follow the steps of the recipe? Or do you want me to teach you how to shop for the ingredients, understand why those are the ingredients to the recipe, understand modifications you can make if you have some sort of dietary exceptionality, whether it be a restriction or a choice? Do you want to understand what happens if, for example, you need to be able to cook that same recipe using several different methods, whether it be stovetop, oven, or barbecue? Like, do you want those things? And of course, the answer is always, well, yeah, I'd rather know that. Right. So then why are you sticking at this surface level thing then?
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's a starting point.
Understand the why.
Bingo.
So this is interesting. Can we see, because now, okay, this is going to be released, so I'm not sure when. Your book will hopefully be out at that point. Can we see what it looks like?
this book is being released almost as we speak.
This is so
And so
news
the,
right now.
the ebook is live right now,
Well, the ebook is.
like as of
Okay.
5 minutes ago. The ebook is now live.
Oh my God.
The paperback and the hardcover are under review. And soon as they are approved, they will be on Amazon. And then we'll be making the book at a later time available even in bookstores.
So what are we looking at here? Are we talking about the human and the machine, right? We're looking at that. Who created this is gorgeous. Tell us more about graphic here.
Okay, well, so this was a process. Ken saw me, he just started smiling because this was a process. So, in many ways, Ken and I were coming up with our own concepts. We were writing things out. Well, what if it looked like this? What if it looked like that? And then experimenting the very same things that we encourage in the classroom, right? Having to learn different image generators, AI image generators, right? So having to learn them, having to learn, how they operate and what seems to be some of the outputs that are more common, depending on if you're using a DALL-E or if you're using a Midjourney or any of the others, Adobe Firefly. So like learning what the other ones exist and then how their outputs come out and then how to utilize them. But at some point, we finally came to this agreement that what we wanted was a form of bifurcation between, man, machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And wanting it to really look like, well, what we have, because what we have right now, I believe in education is, right, we have lots of technology adoption, right? I mean, it's everywhere. It is what we are utilizing right now. We have tech that's on us, that's around us, that surrounds us, that listens to us, that adapts to us in various ways. And we've become comfortable with these various forms of technology. The big question is the question, not the answer. Are we potentially giving away all of our humanity to technology? Right? How much of our humanity are we willing to give to the algorithms, and what are some of the negative repercussions that can result from that? Like, those are real questions.
Yes.
How do we mitigate some of those things? And how do we take this beyond just a personal, this is me, I'm willing to check the box to give you, permission to see all that I do and to reuse it? How much are we doing that in the personal level? How much are we, as an entire society, potentially transforming everything in how we operate based on the emergence of AI? And as AI is learning, how much of it are we allowing to potentially, what are we giving up, right? And again, it's the question, it's the potential of good thing and it's the potential of bad things. So hopefully that's what you are gathering some from this image, but we're more curious what your thoughts are.
I mean, I thought, again, human versus machine, promises and perils perhaps in there too. I love, so the byline is yin yang, maybe. Yeah. Well, tell us what the byline was again, because I really like that. It was the ethics and equity.
Ethics and equity have entered the chat.
I love that. That is really cool. Have entered the chat. I love it. It's have entered the chat. That's so cool. That was brilliant. What else? What else do you see, Jerry?
Well, I see also the contrast to black and white. And I know this last week, it has been a huge topic of conversation on Twitter. People have really been talking about the cover of the book. People really like it. I think because you were so intentional about it, it makes us think of the dichotomy, two different opposites.
Yeah.
And how does it all align? Is what it makes me think of.
Talking that much about the cover, can you imagine what's in the book? That's all I have to say.
Right?
Yes. Yes. I'm ready to hit the buy button, get it in my cart and buy it.
I know we're concluding. I just want to throw in what you all have done, even in this last couple of minutes, literally is the ultimate goal that Dee and I have. You all are that even the cover gets you start to thinking.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And that's what you want us to do. That's all you ever want us to do. You push people's thinking. And that's what the two of you did together as you collaborated on this. You pushed each other's thinking and you used that collaboration to push our thinking. So I am looking forward to digging into this. We are recording this pre-ISTE. I think it will be coming out post-ISTE. Are you bringing these books? Are you going to have them so people can buy them? I'm hoping. All right, good.
And for folks that are ISTE, they happen to get a hands on their copy and they find one of us, and then they have to go where in the world is Carmen San Diego, and they have to find the other one.
Oh, I just thought of a good idea because we are doing a Linking Leaders event together with all of our past LinkedUp guests, all of our past perspectives guests. Can you fall in both those categories? And our Linking Leaders. And so what we'll do is if we could, unless your dance car is already full at that time, we'll do a signing, a book signing there. Did you do that?
Let me talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that for sure.
Good. Yeah, I'm excited.
But thank you so much. I think we could have gone on for hours.
Yeah. Maybe a part two.
No doubt.
Yes.
Maybe there should be a book study. We'll have read the book and we'll do a book study on it. That'll be fun.
Perfect.
That sounds great.
I will add, Dee and I actually are actively working on a study guide to go with the book right now as well.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
So,
great.
Not to say don't do the book study, but we literally were like, okay, what are the things we would want you to be able to take away from each chapter if you were to do a book study? That was our design provocation. So we are working on that right now. I would anticipate that plus the audio version of the book, which won't be just us reading it. It'll be an audio listening experience. The goal is for those to come out by the end of the summer.
Oh, great.
Wow. You guys have thought of it all. I mean, that's the point. I mean, it's the immersion, it's the engagement, and the ownership and buy-in, as we talked about, should be happening in the classroom, and you're making it happen for us. Yes. Love it. Love it so much. Yeah. All right. This has been awesome as usual. Yes. Thank you so much. Always. And we're looking forward to seeing you soon. Couple weeks.
Good. Can't wait. In person. Yay. Big hugs.
Right. That's right.
Building relationships. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.